a quiet girl, an arrogant teacher, and a piano. What began as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that silenced the entire classroom and shattered the proudest egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables. Not with words, but with music. The iron gates of Crestmore Academy stood tall under the golden morning sun, a symbol of prestige and exclusivity. It was one of New York's most elite private schools, a place where wealth and status weren't just advantages but expectations. Luxury cars rolled into the school's grand parking lot, doors opening to reveal students dressed in designer outfits, effortlessly stylish and exuding confidence. Laughter echoed across the school's beautifully maintained courtyard, paved with gleaming marble, where those born into privilege belonged as naturally as breathing. A little further away, Alina Hart stepped off an aging school bus, her slightly worn sneakers touching the pavement. No one turned to acknowledge her. No one welcomed her. At Crestmore, Elena was invisible. She had no sleek sports car, no high-end handbags, no perfectly styled hair like the other girls. She didn't belong to the world of the wealthy, and they made sure she never forgot it. Tightening the straps of her backpack, Elena moved quickly past groups of students, trying to make herself as small as possible. She never sought attention, but staying unnoticed wasn't always an option, especially when Charlotte Kensington was around. With long, silky blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, Charlotte was the embodiment of perfection in the eyes of teachers and parents alike. She wasn't just beautiful, she was the daughter of an influential family, one with deep ties to politics and finance. For Charlotte, everything had a price: power, fame, and even the ability to control those around her. And Elena? To her, she was a stain on Crestmore's polished image. "Look, it's the scholarship girl," Charlotte's voice rang out as Elena passed through the courtyard. "I wonder if she even has enough money for breakfast today," one of Charlotte's friends added with a smirk. "I bet she doesn't. Maybe she'll beg for food at the church like she always does," another snickered. Elena bit her lip but didn't stop walking. She was used to their taunts. At Crestmore Academy, everything revolved around wealth. Those without it weren't just looked down upon, they were ignored altogether. And sometimes being ignored was better than becoming a target. After school, Elena didn't return to a sprawling mansion or an expensive restaurant like her classmates. She went back to a modest apartment in Brooklyn, where her mother, Mara Hart, was still working a late shift at the hospital. Their home was small, but it was warm. And no matter how tired she was, Mara always tried to spend time with her daughter. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Mara asked, forcing a smile despite the dark circles under her eyes. "Same as usual, Mom," Elena replied, keeping her voice neutral, hiding the exhaustion of being looked down upon. But there was one thing that made Elena different. One thing that Charlotte and her privileged world could never take from her: music. Since childhood, Elena had been drawn to the piano. While other kids played with dolls or watched cartoons, she would spend hours at the local church's old upright piano, her tiny fingers gliding over its chipped keys. She had no private instructor, no expensive sheet music, but that never stopped her. She listened to Debussy, Beethoven, and Chopin on her aging phone and painstakingly taught herself to play by ear. She borrowed music books from the library, studied every note, and practiced with all her heart. She didn't just play the piano, she lived it. But at Crestmore, her dream had no place. The piano was a status symbol for the elite. Charlotte and her circle had the finest instructors money could buy, practicing on grand pianos that cost more than Elena's entire apartment. And Elena? She played in secret, hidden away in the quiet of the church when no one was around. She had never dared to play in front of others. But all of that was about to change. That day in music class, Professor Alden Royce, the school's long-standing music teacher, made an announcement. "Today, I want each of you to perform an impromptu piano piece," he said, his voice dry and authoritative. "I want to see emotion, not just notes you've memorized." The room buzzed with excitement. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, smirking. She had been playing piano since she was 3 and had performed at every major school event. Elena, on the other hand, wanted to disappear. She had no intention of participating. But Professor Royce had other plans. "Elena Hart," he called out suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you give it a try? Or are you only capable of listening to music through your headphones?" A stunned silence fell over the room. Then laughter erupted. Charlotte folded her arms, a knowing smile on her lips, eyes flashing with amusement. A chill ran down Elena's spine. This wasn't an invitation. This was a challenge, a setup to humiliate her. Charlotte wanted to see her fail. Professor Royce wanted to prove she didn't belong. She could refuse. She could shake her head and stay seated, let the moment pass like she always did. But something inside her wouldn't let her. She thought of the countless nights spent practicing alone in silence. And slowly, deliberately, Elena Hart stood up. Elena Hart had spent countless nights practicing in silence, letting her dreams take shape in the stillness of the church. Dreams she had never dared to say out loud. But today, she could no longer hide them. She stood up. All eyes turned to her. Elena Hart walked to the piano, and for the first time in her life, she made the decision to show the world what she could do. Her hand lightly gripped the hem of her uniform, her breath shallow and uneven as she felt the weight of the entire room pressing down on her. But the anticipation in the air wasn't the kind that lifted spirits. It was heavy, sharp, cruel. No one was waiting to be impressed. They were waiting for her to stumble, to fail, to become the joke of the day. And at the center of it all stood Professor Alden Royce, watching her with a smirk that held layers of meaning. He was a man in his 50s, thin but with a presence that demanded authority. His voice never needed to rise. His mere posture was enough to command obedience. For over 2 decades, Professor Royce had been a fixture at Crestmore Academy, his reputation unwavering among the wealthy parents who trusted him to cultivate the talents of their privileged children. They liked him. They liked how he polished their kids' natural abilities, pushing them toward success. Success that was already within their reach. He organized prestigious recitals, exclusive competitions where only the right students got the spotlight. The chosen ones. And students like Elena? They weren't meant to shine. She had no private tutor, no years of training under elite instructors, no parents who could donate a new concert hall to the school. To Professor Royce, Elena Hart was just a name on his roster. A student who kept her grades high enough to remain unnoticed. But nothing about her was worth his attention. And now, watching her sit there quietly among the giggles of Charlotte Kensington and her friends, a thought struck him. He could teach her a lesson. A lesson about knowing one's place. The slow, deliberate sound of Professor Royce's leather shoes tapping against the polished wooden floor echoed through the classroom as he stepped forward. Then, with a voice smooth and drawn out, he spoke. Elena Hart. She stiffened. Perhaps you'd like to give it a try? Or do you only know how to listen to music through your headphones? His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut deep, like a carefully honed blade. The room erupted into laughter. Charlotte smirked, crossing her arms, her expression filled with amusement. Others exchanged glances, whispering just loud enough for Elena to hear. A few covered their mouths, stifling laughter. Professor Royce knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't simply asking a student to perform. He was publicly calling out someone he had already decided was destined to fail. He was creating a stage, not for music, but for humiliation. A situation where Elena would feel so small, so crushed, that she would never dare to step forward again. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be their entertainment. Didn't want to give Charlotte the satisfaction of watching her fail. She could refuse. She could shake her head and sit still, let it pass. Surely Professor Royce couldn't force her. But if she stayed seated, if she let this moment slip away, then the whispers, the smirks, the condescending laughter, they would become the truth. They would write her story for her. That she was nothing special, that she didn't deserve music, that she was just a poor girl with a foolish dream. Her fists clenched. Then in one swift, decisive moment, she looked up, her gaze locked onto Professor Royce's. His eyes gleamed with anticipation, waiting for her to back down, waiting for her to shake her head, to admit she was too afraid. But she didn't. She took a deep breath, and she stood. The room seemed to shrink as Elena Hart, 15 years old, walked toward the grand piano at the center of the classroom. Each step felt impossibly heavy, as though she were carrying the weight of every doubt, every insult, every barrier ever placed before her. The laughter had stopped. Now there was something else. Curiosity. Charlotte squinted slightly, her head tilting, watching Elena as though she couldn't believe this girl had actually accepted the challenge. Professor Royce raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but he hid it quickly, replacing it with a small, knowing smile. Elena reached the piano. She pulled out the wooden bench and sat down. Her hands hovered over the keys. The air was thick with expectation. She knew what was at stake. If she faltered, if her fingers trembled, if she hesitated for even a second, no one would ever let her forget it. From the front of the room, Professor Royce crossed his arms and gave a small nod, his voice holding the weight of a challenge. "Go ahead, Hart, we're all waiting." And Elena Hart, the girl no one believed in, pressed her fingers to the keys and began to play. Professor Royce crossed his arms, his eyes sharp with challenge. "Go ahead, Hart, we're all waiting." Elena closed her eyes and took a slow, steady breath. She had to block everything out, the whispers, the stares, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. When she opened them again, her fingers rested gently on the piano keys. A single note rang out, soft, delicate, like the first raindrop on a parched landscape. A second note followed, then another. The sound was gentle, fragile, like a whisper trying to break through the heavy silence. And then, a muffled giggle shattered it. The spell was broken. A wave of cold rushed through Elena's veins as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, not with admiration but with mockery. From the far side of the room, Charlotte Kensington tossed her golden hair back, crossing her legs in that effortless way she always did. She turned to her friends with an amused smirk. She didn't need to say a word. Just a raised eyebrow was enough. The group burst into laughter. "Well, this should be interesting," one of Charlotte's friends whispered, her voice dripping with amusement. "She probably hasn't even touched a real piano before." Another chimed in, just loud enough for Elena to hear. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She could feel their stares, the sharp-edged looks that sliced into her, waiting for her to fail, for her to crumble. And at the center of it all was Professor Royce. His face remained impassive. He didn't laugh. He didn't join in. But the way he stood, arms folded, head tilted slightly to the side, it was all the confirmation she needed. This wasn't a lesson. This was a test she was never meant to pass. He had seen students like her before, outsiders, dreamers, and in his experience, reality always crushed them. She was just another one of them. Another foolish girl who thought talent alone could open doors meant only for the privileged. Another name that would fade into nothing. Elena blinked, not to focus, but to push back the memories surging inside her. The first time she touched the old church piano, its keys worn and uneven, yet to her, more beautiful than the grandest Steinway. The nights she had stayed awake, listening to classical pieces on her broken headphones, trying to memorize every note. The quiet evenings when her mother came home after a long hospital shift, exhausted but still managing a smile, stretching every dollar just to keep food on the table. The scholarships she had applied for, only to receive rejection after rejection. The well-meaning teachers who had patted her shoulder and said, "Elena, maybe you should focus on something more practical instead of chasing a dream like music." For a long time, she had believed them. Maybe they were right. Maybe music wasn't for people like her. Maybe if this had been another day, another time, another version of herself, she would have backed down, lowered her head, let Charlotte and Professor Royce have the victory they wanted. But today was different. Something had changed. She took a breath, her fingers still resting on the keys. And this time, they didn't tremble. She lifted her head. She met Charlotte's eyes, unwavering, met the stares of those who wanted to see her fail. She could have walked away, could have pretended she didn't know how to play, let Professor Royce shake his head and move on. She could have taken the easy way out, but she didn't. She didn't need to prove anything to him. She didn't need to make Charlotte respect her. She just needed to prove something to herself, that she was not as small as they wanted her to believe. She exhaled slowly, relaxed her shoulders, her fingers glided across the keys, and this time, nothing could stop her. The room gradually fell silent. The mocking laughter, once so loud, faded. The tension that had filled the air, the quiet expectation of failure, it vanished. The melody of Clair de Lune floated through the room, a sound so soft yet so powerful that it demanded to be heard. Professor Royce, who had remained still with his arms crossed, suddenly shifted. His expression changed. His eyes narrowed as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And Charlotte, who had been lounging against a desk, her usual careless confidence wrapped around her like a cloak. She sat up. For the first time, her smugness was replaced by something else. Something closer to disbelief. The girl she had written off as nothing was playing. And she wasn't just playing, she was commanding the room. Charlotte Kensington, who had been lounging with a smug, carefree attitude, suddenly sat up straight, her brows furrowed, an expression she had never worn before. The other students, the same ones who had scoffed when Elena Hart's name was called, now fell into stunned silence. They had been waiting for a disaster. A wrong note, a trembling hand, a performance so clumsy it would cement Elena's status as an outsider forever. But instead, what they heard was something else entirely. Something they couldn't laugh at. Something undeniable. Elena didn't look at anyone. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her. Because she knew this was the moment she had to show them who she truly was. The first notes floated through the air, light as a breath. But each one seemed to cut through the heavy tension in the room, slicing through the weight of judgment, disbelief, and expectation. She felt the shift. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to whisper. But even as her fingers moved, a sudden wave of doubt surged within her. For a fleeting second, she nearly stopped. She almost stood up, as if some invisible force was pulling her away from the piano. If she walked away now, she could escape it all. The judging stares, the waiting eyes, Charlotte, Professor Royce, everyone who had never wanted to see her succeed. She could leave, and no one would expect anything more from her ever again. But then, like a soft wind blowing through her thoughts, she heard her mother's voice. You don't have to prove anything to them, but never let anyone make you feel small. The words were like a flicker of light in the dark, a warmth in the cold, and Elena stayed. Charlotte leaned forward, propping her elbows on the desk. Her sharp green eyes were locked onto Elena, waiting for her to fail. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The raised eyebrow, the half smile. Go on, her expression seemed to say. Show us how bad you are. The others in the class were the same. Some still whispered. Others leaned back, arms crossed, prepared to laugh the moment she made a mistake. Then her gaze met Professor Royce's. His smirk was gone. He wasn't smiling anymore, but he wasn't frowning either. His expression was something unreadable, somewhere between amusement and surprise, like a hunter watching his prey, calmly waiting. Because he was sure he knew how this would end, sure she would fail. Elena felt her heart racing, not out of fear, because she was standing at a crossroads. If she played, she would step beyond this moment, beyond them. But if she failed, she would forever be just another girl who didn't belong, and she would not let that happen. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then she played. The first note sounded, followed by a silence so deep it felt like she had stepped into another world. A world where there were no whispers, no laughter, no Charlotte, no Professor Royce, just the music, Claire de Lune. The melody wrapped around the classroom, its gentle yet powerful waves sweeping over everything, washing away the doubt, the mockery, the walls they had built around her. Charlotte stopped laughing. She sat up straight, eyes wide, her lips parting slightly, not in amusement, but in something closer to confusion. The students who had expected a mess, a shaky performance full of mistakes, they couldn't move. And Professor Royce, who had always worn the same calm, collected expression, his brow furrowed. It was just a small movement, barely noticeable. But it was there, because he hadn't expected this. They thought she would tremble. They thought she would falter, that she would be afraid. Instead, she was brilliant. Elena didn't need to look at them. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, letting it flow through her fingers as though it had always lived inside her, waiting for this moment to break free. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to step onto the stage, and no one would pull her down again. The piano's sound filled the room, smooth yet unshakable, not weak, strong. Each note carried something unspoken, determination, defiance, resilience. Like a voice that had been silenced for too long but had now finally found the courage to speak. At first, Elena focused only on the keys, on the rhythm she had memorized through years of lonely practice. But as the music continued, she no longer thought about Charlotte. She no longer thought about Professor Royce. She no longer thought about anyone in the room. There was only the piano. There was only the music. And the world, for the first time, was finally listening. Elena Hart no longer thought about the people around her. She didn't care about Charlotte Kensington, the girl who had spent years making her feel invisible. She didn't care about Professor Royce, whose indifference had once made her doubt herself. All that remained was the music. The classroom was silent. Some students sat up a little straighter, as if realizing too late that this was not the disaster they had anticipated. Charlotte, who had been reclining in her chair, waiting for Elena to embarrass herself, now leaned forward. Her elbows rested on the desk, her sharp green eyes locked onto Elena's hands. The smirk, the condescending amusement, all of it was gone. The students who had once laughed at the mention of Elena's name now sat frozen. Their silence wasn't just shock, they had been swept into the music. A sound so raw, so undeniable, that it could not be mocked. But the most significant change was not in the students. It was in Professor Royce. At first, he had stood with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man patiently waiting for a lesson to be learned. He had believed this would be simple, that she would falter, that she would fail, that he would prove, once and for all, that some students were simply not meant to belong. But as the notes filled the air, the certainty in his eyes vanished. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, subtle but unmistakable. Because, in that moment, he realized something. He had been wrong. He had expected mistakes. He had been convinced she wouldn't be able to handle such a complex piece. But what he was hearing was something even the most privileged, most trained students in the room could not replicate. It wasn't just skill. It wasn't just technical ability. Elena played with her soul. Every note carried the weight of years spent practicing in secret. Every melody echoed the quiet nights where music had been her only friend. Every chord was built from sacrifice, determination, and an unwavering love for something no one had ever nurtured in her. She had learned in the dark, played in empty rooms, turned music into her escape, her voice, her truth. And now it filled the room with a power no one could deny. She didn't need to look at Charlotte, didn't need to search for approval in Professor Royce's eyes. She knew she had been right to sit at this piano. She was no longer the girl who had shrunk under laughter in the back of the classroom. She was a pianist. She continued to play, each note wrapping around the students, pulling them into a world from which none of them could escape. For the first time, Charlotte, always confident, always in control, felt powerless. She gripped the edge of her desk, her fingers tense. She glanced around, searching for her friends, for someone to validate what she was feeling, someone to remind her that Elena didn't matter. But no one looked back. Because they were no longer thinking about Charlotte. They were listening, completely unquestionably listening. The mocking laughter was gone, the whispers had disappeared, nothing remained except the music. And Elena played as if her very existence depended on it. Because in a way it did. This was more than a performance. This was her declaration that she was here, that she mattered, that no one, not Charlotte, not Professor Royce, not the world that had told her she didn't belong, would silence her ever again. Professor Royce stood motionless. His arms, once tightly crossed, had fallen to his sides. His usual mask of calm had cracked. He didn't want to admit it. But he knew. He had witnessed something that had changed him. Elena had not failed. She had done what no one had expected. She had conquered them all. And then, the final note rang out. The sound lingered in the air for a moment, then faded, like ripples in a still lake after a single drop of water. And then, nothing. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire class was still trying to process what had just happened. Elena opened her eyes. She looked down at the keys, her breath still uneven. But her heart no longer pounded with fear. She had done it. She had let the music speak for her. And in that moment, she knew everything had changed. The silence stretched. It felt endless. The kind of silence that didn't come from discomfort, but from something undeniably powerful. A silence louder than any applause, louder than any insult, louder than all the years of being overlooked. She remained seated, her hands still resting on the piano keys, as if grounding herself in this reality. Something unfamiliar rose in her chest. It wasn't fear, it wasn't relief. It was something stronger. A realization. She had done what no one thought was possible. She had made their entire world go silent. Charlotte, who had spent years making sure everyone knew their place, now sat motionless. The laughter was gone. The smugness had vanished, and for the first time, there was nothing left between them but the truth. The students who had been so eager to see her fail exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain, as if they themselves couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. There were no more whispers, no more sneers, no more arrogance, just the undeniable, inescapable truth. Elena Hart had proved them all wrong. Elena Hart lifted her gaze, and for the first time, Charlotte Kensington did not look untouchable. The girl who had always radiated perfection, who had never allowed herself to appear less than anyone else, now sat motionless. Her green eyes, usually filled with sharp confidence, were wide open in stunned silence. There were no sly smirks, no condescending amusement, no subtle laughter. only disbelief, because this was not what she had expected. What had she imagined? A clumsy performance? An awkward, humiliated Elena stumbling over the keys, her head lowering in shame as the class erupted in laughter? Charlotte had been so sure, so certain that Elena would be nothing more than a passing joke. But instead, she was sitting there, forced to acknowledge something she had never even considered possible. And that infuriated her. Because it wasn't just the shock that unsettled her. It was the truth. The truth that Elena Hart was not the weak, insignificant girl she had always assumed her to be. The truth that Elena didn't need wealth, designer clothes, or a prestigious last name to be remarkable. The truth that there was something in Elena that money could never buy. Charlotte clenched the edge of her desk, fingers tightening against the polished wood. Her mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Because what could she say? No insult could erase what had just happened. No snide remark could undo the music that had filled the room, silencing them all. And Charlotte Kensington, for the first time in her life, had nothing to say. But she wasn't the only one who had lost control of the moment. Elena turned toward Professor Royce. He was still standing in the same place, but he looked different. The smug indifference that had once rested so easily on his face was gone. If before, he had looked at her with the quiet expectation of failure, now his expression was unreadable. His sharp, assessing eyes locked onto Elena, as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. Because everything he had believed, everything he had assumed, had just been shattered. For years, Professor Royce had built his reputation on recognizing talent, on knowing who deserved a place on the stage and who belonged in the background. And Elena Hart had been nothing more than a background name on a class roster. But now, he could no longer ignore her, because this wasn't just talent, it was something more, something rare, something undeniable. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. Elena's fingers were still resting on the keys. They trembled slightly, but not from fear, not from exhaustion, from something much deeper. She had touched something today, something bigger than a classroom performance. She had forced them, all of them, to see her in a way they never had before. And then, a single clap broke the silence, soft, steady, then another, and another, until the sound grew into something unstoppable. The class erupted into applause. Some students stood, clapping with genuine excitement. They hadn't expected it. Some were still stunned, caught between disbelief and awe, but none of them could deny it. Elena looked around, breathless. The very people who had laughed at her, who had been waiting for her to fail, were now applauding. Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because they couldn't deny what they had just heard. And that was the greatest victory of all. Professor Royce remained still. He did not clap. He could not. Because to clap would be an admission, an acceptance of how utterly wrong he had been. Instead, he slowly inhaled, his sharp eyes still locked onto Elena, as if reevaluating everything he thought he knew. Charlotte turned away. She couldn't watch this any longer. She bit her lip, hands clenched into fists under the desk. She had spent years making sure she was at the center of attention. And now, for the first time, she wasn't. For the first time, she was the one being pushed aside. And it was Elena Hart who had done it. Elena stood up. She could still feel the echo of her heartbeat pounding in her chest. But this time, it wasn't from anxiety. It wasn't from fear. It was from victory. A victory no one had handed to her. A victory she had claimed for herself. She had made their world go silent. She had let her music speak. And she knew, without a doubt, from this day forward, they would never look at her the same way again. The final note of the piano still lingered in the air, fading slowly, like the moon disappearing behind the horizon. The silence that followed was so deep that Elena could hear her own breath. She could still feel the warmth of the piano keys beneath her fingertips. But she didn't hurry to leave her seat. She didn't seek approval in anyone's eyes. She simply let the moment exist, like a quiet declaration, like an unshakable truth. And this time, no one could take it away from her. A quiet breeze seemed to pass through the room, not one that could be felt, but one that could be sensed. It sank into the cracks of the people who had doubted her, settling into the spaces where their certainty had once lived. The air in the classroom was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the podium, on Professor Royce, who stood utterly motionless. His gaze was locked onto Elena Hart, as though he could not comprehend what had just happened. In a room full of students, he had believed he understood. Where he had been so sure of who had talent and who did not, he now realized that his biases had betrayed him. His fingers twitched, as if he wanted to make some sort of gesture. But he didn't. His lips pressed into a firm line, his face torn between reluctant acknowledgement and the stubborn ego he had carried for years. The entire class was waiting. No one whispered now, no one laughed, no one sneered, because they had seen something they never thought possible. Someone they had dismissed as insignificant had done something they could not ignore. And now, they all wanted to know how Professor Royce would respond. He inhaled deeply, as though swallowing something bitter. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I didn't expect this." His voice was measured, carefully restrained. "You did well." The words echoed in the silence, but there was no warmth in them, no true admiration. It was not a compliment. It was a reluctant concession, recognition from a man who didn't want to admit the truth but could not deny it. A few students exchanged glances, some furrowed their brows waiting for him to say more, but he didn't, and that was enough for Elena to understand. She had forced him to see her, but she would never need his approval. She took a slow breath and then she stood up. Her gaze did not waver as she looked directly into Professor Royce's eyes. She did not lower her head. She did not say thank you. She did not pretend to be grateful for his reluctant acknowledgement. Instead, her voice rang out, clear, sharp, undeniable. "Everyone has talent. What matters is whether you have the eyes to see it." The words sliced through the room like a blade. Not loud, not angry, but undeniably powerful. No one moved, no one breathed. Even Charlotte Kensington, who had sat frozen since the performance ended, turned her head sharply, her eyes wide with shock. Her friends, who had spent years laughing at Elena, sat in stunned silence. Because they knew, this wasn't just aimed at Professor Royce. This was aimed at all of them. At every person who had ever looked at Elena and decided she wasn't worth noticing. At everyone who had ever thought they had the right to decide who mattered and who didn't. A chill settled over the classroom. And then, something unexpected happened. A round of applause erupted, but this time, it wasn't for the music, it was for her words. Some students, even those who had always ignored her, began to nod. A few exchanged glances, as if realizing something they had never considered before. A quiet smile flickered on the lips of one student, a girl who had always followed Charlotte but had never spoken up. A boy near the back, someone Elena had never thought would even look her way, muttered under his breath, "She's right." The change wasn't obvious, but it was real. It was there in the way some students started looking at Elena differently, in the way they no longer saw her as an outsider, in the way they glanced at Professor Royce, no longer with blind trust but with careful reconsideration. And most importantly, it was there in Elena herself. She no longer felt like she needed to seek validation. She no longer felt like she had to fight to be seen. She knew, with quiet certainty, she had changed something. Maybe just a little, maybe just for a moment, but she had made them reconsider what they thought they knew. And that was worth more than any empty praise. Professor Royce said nothing. He only stared at Elena, battling something within himself. But in the end, he did not argue, because he couldn't. She had let her music speak, and now she had let herself speak. Whether he wanted to or not, he had to accept it. Elena Hart had reclaimed her place in this world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The classroom remained frozen in the aftermath of Elena Hart's performance. Some students sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. Others still seemed unsure, caught between their old assumptions and the truth they had just witnessed. And then there was Charlotte Kensington. Her nails dug into her palm beneath the desk, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The way the entire classroom had shifted in a matter of minutes. The way Elena, a girl she had always dismissed as unimportant, had managed to disrupt everything. But Elena no longer cared about what they thought. She had said what needed to be said. She had let her music speak. And now, whether anyone acknowledged it or not, she knew she was no longer the outsider they had once thought she was. Just as the tension in the room teetered between praise and uncertainty, the door to the classroom swung open. Every head turned. A woman stepped inside. Miss Evelyn Porter, one of Crestmore Academy's longest-serving teachers, a woman respected not just by the students but by the entire faculty. Her graying hair was neatly pulled back, and her sharp eyes carried a quiet authority. She stood with the kind of posture that belonged to someone who understood the true responsibility of being an educator. But it wasn't just her presence that made the moment so profound. It was the way she looked at Elena the moment she entered the room. As if she had been waiting for this. As if she had just found something she had spent a long time searching for. She paid no attention to the stunned expressions of the students, didn't acknowledge Professor Royce's uncomfortable stiffness, didn't even glance at Charlotte's simmering discontent. She only looked at Elena. And then, in a calm but unmistakably weighty voice, she asked, "Have you ever considered applying for a music scholarship?" The word sent a shockwave through the room. The world seemed to slow as Elena's eyes widened. A scholarship? Her heart pounded, confusion and disbelief swirling in her chest. Had she misheard? Had Miss Porter really just asked her that? A music scholarship had always felt like an impossible dream. She had spent her childhood at an old church piano, teaching herself in secret, playing alone in the quiet corners where no one could hear her. She had practiced for years, not for competitions, not for applause, but because she couldn't not play. But a scholarship? That was something she had never even let herself imagine. At Crestmore Academy, students like Charlotte had parents who spent tens of thousands of dollars on private tutors. They had grand pianos in their living rooms. They had access to the best music programs, the best instructors, the best everything. And she? She had passion. But in this world, passion had never been enough. She had never dared to believe she could stand among the elite, among those trained to be musical prodigies from birth. Never imagined that someone, anyone, would recognize what she had spent her whole life pouring into the piano. But now, standing before her was a teacher she had always admired from afar, asking her a question she had never thought she would hear. Miss Porter's gaze never wavered. She wasn't asking this out of kindness. She wasn't offering pity. She was serious. Because she had seen something in Elena that no one else had. Beside her, Charlotte clenched her fists under the desk. Her nails dug so hard into her palm that she barely noticed the pain. She tried to keep her face neutral. But the tension in her jaw, in her posture, it was undeniable, because she knew. She had always been the star. She was the one teachers praised, the one parents admired, the one chosen for every prestigious school performance. She had spent her entire life securing her position at the top, making sure no one could ever outshine her. And yet, right in front of her, someone she had once considered unworthy of her attention was being offered an opportunity that she herself had never been handed. Not Charlotte Kensington, Elena Hart. It made her blood boil. But she couldn't say anything. She couldn't argue. She couldn't look at Miss Porter and say, "You're wrong," because everything that had just happened proved otherwise, and that realization drove her mad. Elena still hadn't spoken. She was still too stunned. She glanced around the room, seeing faces that had once looked at her with mockery, now watching her with something closer to curiosity, something closer to respect. She turned toward Professor Royce. For the first time, she saw uncertainty in his expression. He wasn't looking at her with his usual dismissiveness. In fact, he wasn't looking at her at all. His gaze was fixed on Miss Porter, avoiding Elena entirely, as if he felt threatened. Because if Elena Hart was truly being offered a chance at a music scholarship, if she really had an opportunity to leave this place and pursue her dream, then his entire perception of talent, of worth, of success would have to change. She looked down at her hands, her fingers still tingling with the lingering echo of the music she had just played. Maybe this wasn't just a dream anymore. Maybe this was a door opening in front of her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions rising in her chest. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, and she met Miss Porter's unwavering gaze. Her voice caught for a moment, because even now, even after everything, even after proving herself, after silencing an entire room, she still couldn't quite believe this was happening. She took another breath, steadied herself, and then she spoke. I want to try." The words felt strange on Elena Hart's lips, as if saying them aloud would somehow make this moment too real. But it was real. And the moment she said it, Miss Porter smiled, a knowing, satisfied smile, as if she had been expecting this answer all along. But at the back of the classroom, Charlotte Kensington felt like her world was coming apart. Everything she had built, her status, her place at the top, the quiet certainty that no one could touch her, had just shifted beneath her feet. Elena had done the impossible, and Charlotte could do nothing to stop it. Alina left the classroom in silence. Her steps were light, but inside, her heart felt like a storm. She had no idea what she had been expecting. She didn't know how long this feeling would last, how much things would truly change. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the Elena Hart of yesterday. She walked down the hallway, passing clusters of students still lost in their own conversations. Some turned to look at her. Not with mockery, not with dismissal, but with curiosity. Acknowledgement, maybe even a little admiration. She stepped through the school gates. A cool breeze brushed against her skin, lifting strands of her hair as she crossed the threshold of Crestmore Academy. And it was only then, with the iron gates behind her, that she realized her heart was still pounding. Everything that had happened today, the music, the stunned silence, the applause, Charlotte's speechless expression, Professor Royce's rare discomfort, Miss Porter's unexpected offer, it all felt like a dream. But it wasn't. It was real. The weight of that realization hit her all at once. And before she even knew what she was doing, she started to run, not out of fear, not to escape, but because she needed to get home. She needed to tell her mother, to tell her what had happened, something she had never dared to believe could happen in her life. Her old sneakers slapped against the pavement as she raced through the streets, past the tiny grocery store where her mother always stopped after her shift, past the bus stop where she had stood so many mornings, dreading another day at school, past the familiar sidewalks she had walked 1,000 times, always believing this would be her whole world. Always believing there was no way out, but now, maybe there was. Maybe, for the first time, she had a chance. She reached the small apartment complex, breathless, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The moment her fingers touched the doorknob, tears welled up in her eyes. But they weren't tears of pain, not tears of frustration or helplessness. They were tears of hope. She pushed open the door. And there she was, Mara Hart. Her mother, standing in the doorway, still in her nurse's uniform, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. A few silver strands were beginning to streak her hair, but she still radiated warmth, strength, and unwavering love. She had just come home from work. But the moment she saw her daughter standing there, eyes red, chest rising and falling from the long run home, worry filled her face. "Elena, sweetheart, what happened?" But Elena couldn't hold back anymore. She rushed forward, throwing herself into her mother's embrace. And the moment her mother's arms wrapped around her, she knew. She had done it. She had broken down the invisible walls that had trapped her for so long. She had proven, not to them but to herself, that she was worthy, that she belonged, that the world had finally heard her. Her voice shook as she whispered the words, "Mom, I played." She pulled back slightly, looking up into her mother's kind, searching eyes, and they listened to me. Mara's gaze softened. She placed her hands gently on Elena's cheeks, brushing back a few damp strands of hair. "Tell me everything, sweetheart." And Elena did. She told her about Professor Royce's sharp words, how the entire class had waited for her to fail. She told her about Charlotte's smirk, the way the students had whispered, the way she had almost let fear win. She told her how she had thought about giving up, until she remembered her mother's words. Until she decided to fight back with music. She told her about the silence that had followed, about the way the class had listened, about Miss Porter's offer, a music scholarship, a door she had never thought would open for someone like her. Her mother listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't speak. She just held Elena's hand, her grip firm and steady, as if she wanted to preserve this moment forever. And when Elena finally stopped, the last of her tears slipping down her cheeks, Mara smiled. She reached up, smoothing her daughter's hair with quiet affection, and in a soft, steady voice she said, "You've always been enough, sweetheart. You just needed to believe it." Elena stilled. She had heard those words before. Her mother had told her 100 times. But today, they meant something entirely different. Before, she had thought her mother said them just to comfort her, just to soften the reality of a world that would never accept her. But now, she understood. Her mother had never doubted her. Her mother had never seen her dreams as impossible. It had only ever been Elena who had doubted herself. A feeling, warm and unshakable, settled in her chest. She had changed something today. Not just in that classroom. Not just in Charlotte's mind. Not just in Professor Royce's perception of her. She had changed something inside herself, and she would never let herself forget it again. A realization settled deep within Elena Hart, one so profound that it felt as if something inside her had finally unlocked. Her mother had never doubted her. Her mother had never seen her dream as foolish. Her mother had never believed she wasn't capable. The only person who had doubted Alina Hart was Elena herself. She felt like an invisible knot inside her had just come undone. A weight that had pressed on her for so many years had lifted. And for the first time, she smiled. A real smile. Not one filled with hesitation, not one burdened by fear, but one filled with belief. She was worthy. She could do this. And for the first time, her dream didn't feel like something distant, something belonging to another world. It was right in front of her. The next morning, golden sunlight filtered through her bedroom curtains, casting warm streaks across the walls. Elena sat at her small wooden desk, the glow of her old laptop screen illuminating her face. The words on the screen flickered before her. Crestmore Academy Music Scholarship Application. A form she had never imagined filling out. Just a week ago, she wouldn't have dared. Just a week ago, she was the shy girl in the back row, trying to stay invisible, trying to avoid the cutting stares of Charlotte Kensington and others like her. But now, everything had changed. Her breath came slower, steadier. There was a sparkle in her eyes, a quiet determination she had never seen in herself before. She knew this was just the beginning. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Just because she had talent didn't mean things would suddenly fall into place. But now, she no longer saw her dream as some impossible fantasy. She was touching it. She was stepping toward it. Still, deep inside, some old fears lingered. Even if she got into the scholarship program, even if she was given the chance, could she really stand beside students who had spent years with private instructors? Students who had played expensive grand pianos, who had performed in front of large audiences since they were children? What about her? She had learned alone. Sitting in the corner of a quiet church, her fingers teaching themselves each note, borrowing old, tattered sheet music from the library, straining to read faded ink, practicing at night when no one else could hear, pouring her heart into melodies that only the empty space around her ever witnessed. How could she possibly compete with them? That old familiar doubt whispered in the back of her mind, maybe you're still not good enough. But then, she remembered. She remembered the feeling of placing her hands on the piano keys that day in class. She remembered the absolute silence after she played. The way Charlotte's face had gone pale with disbelief. The way Professor Royce had struggled to find words. She had done what no one thought was possible. She hadn't just been good enough. She had shattered their expectations. And if she could do it once, she could do it again. Determination surged through her. Her fingers clenched into fists, her heart beat with a new kind of confidence. She would not back down. She would not let fear keep her from this moment. She would go all the way. She turned back to the screen and began filling out the application. Full name, Elena Hart, field of expertise, classical piano. Just typing those words sent a strange feeling through her. For so long, she had thought these kinds of forms were meant for other people. For the rich kids, for the ones who never had to wonder if they belonged, for the ones whose parents spent fortunes ensuring their success. But now, she was writing her own name here. Not because someone felt sorry for her, not because someone wanted to help her, but because she deserved to be here. She continued filling out the questions. Why did you choose music? How did you start playing piano? What has music given you? Each answer flowed easily. She had lived these answers. She didn't have to make anything up. Then she reached the last part. A short essay. Why do you deserve this scholarship? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, because she already knew the answer she had always known. And when she opened her eyes again, she began to type. I was not born with the perfect conditions to pursue music. I never had a teacher to guide me. I never owned an expensive piano. I never had the opportunity to perform on a grand stage. But I have something that no amount of money can replace. A love for music. And the perseverance to never give up on it. I played every day, not because someone told me to, not because I was expected to, but because I couldn't live without it. I played with my heart, with the hopes and struggles I carried through every note. And when I placed my hands on the keys, I didn't just create sound. I told my own story. I am not applying for this scholarship because I want special treatment. I am applying because I have something to offer, because I believe my music deserves to be heard, because I know that if I am given this opportunity, I will not waste it. I am not a child with a perfect starting point, but I am someone who knows that. No matter where I start, I will step onto the stage and make the world listen. She read every word, and for the first time, she didn't question it. She didn't doubt herself. She didn't think about what Charlotte or Professor Royce would say. She only thought about the truth she had written. She clicked submit. The screen blinked. Your application has been successfully submitted. She stared at the words and she felt something break open inside her. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a door opening to her future. She had taken the first step, and she would never stop now. No matter where she had started, Elena Hart knew she would step onto the stage and make the world listen. She read every word of her application, feeling each sentence as if it were a part of her soul. There was no more fear, no more doubt, only one certainty. She would do this. With one final breath, she pressed submit. The screen blinked. Your application has been successfully submitted. Elena stared at the words, and in that moment, she felt something break open inside her. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a door opening. She had taken the first step toward her dream. She stood up, crossing the room, and gently shut the door behind her. She sank into the wooden chair next to the old piano, the very place where she had spent countless nights alone, where her fingers had glided over worn keys, carrying her deepest hopes and unspoken fears. This room had once been a sanctuary, but also a prison, a place where she had questioned if she would ever be enough. But today, everything was different. She was no longer the shy girl in the back row, no longer the invisible shadow that Charlotte Kensington could easily trample on, no longer the overlooked student that Professor Royce dismissed without a second thought. She had changed. She was no longer an outsider. She was the girl who had stepped up to the piano, silenced the room, shattered expectations, and let her talent break through the barriers placed in front of her. This scholarship offer, it wasn't a miracle. It wasn't given out of pity. It wasn't handed to her just because someone wanted to give her a chance. It was hers because she deserved it, and she knew it. But she also knew something else. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Charlotte would still try to bring her down. Even with the scholarship, she would face rivals more experienced than her. People who had been ahead of her for years. People who had been trained, polished, given every advantage she had never had. But now, none of that scared her. She placed her fingers lightly on the old keys, gently pressed a note. The sound rang out, not as rich as the grand piano at Crestmore Academy. Not perfect, not refined, but it carried a meaning deeper than any polished note could ever hold. It was her voice. A thought passed through her mind, as clear as if someone had whispered it into her ear. Don't let anyone define your worth. People like Professor Royce, like Charlotte Kensington, they had once thought they could decide who deserved success and who didn't. They thought they could control who was worthy and who wasn't. They were wrong. Because worth doesn't come from fame. It doesn't come from status. It doesn't come from what others think about you. Worth comes from within you. She took a deep breath and began to play. The melody started soft but steady, each note weaving into the next, filling the small room with something bigger than just music. A declaration. A vow that she would never stop, that she would never let anyone silence her again. That no one, not Charlotte, not Professor Royce, not anyone, would ever take this away from her. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her forward, letting the world fade into the melodies she had spent her entire life chasing. And for the first time, she was no longer afraid. Elena Hart wasn't born into the perfect circumstances. She had no paved road laid out for her, no golden opportunities handed to her. But she had refused to let the world define her worth. She had used music to speak for her. And she had proven that talent doesn't belong to the privileged. It belongs to those who are persistent enough, strong enough, and brave enough to pursue it. Her story wasn't just about a girl who played the piano. It was about resilience. It was about daring to rise when the world tries to push you down. It was about turning ridicule into motivation to shine. And now, it was your turn. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had someone try to crush your dreams? What did you do to overcome it? Share your story in the comments below, because you never know, your story might inspire someone else. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, so we can continue bringing you stories of persistence, determination, and people who never give up on their dreams. See you in the next video.